disparaging him as the son of an immigrant. But when she mentioned him offhandedly to her father that Christmas, her father raised his eyebrows and told her that John's father, Knut Mickelson of Pine Rapids, Wisconsin, was not just any immigrant. As a young man fresh from Norway, Knut had started as a dockhand in Green Bay. With pennies he pinched from his wages, he had invested in land to the northwest, unsettled areas covered thick as the hair on a man's arm with towering trees of such girth that a big man could not reach halfway around. He had logged his land himself until he could hire crews. He had sold the logs to be milled until he'd earned enough to build his own sawmill on the Bear Trap River north of Pine Rapids, which was hardly a town at all until then. Wilma's father, who was himself a paperman, said with admiration that Knut was as smart and ruthless as any Yankee, and besides that he'd married a Yankee woman who'd been born and raised in New York, a farm woman who had relished conquering the land and rising in social status as a result, just as much as her immigrant husband had. When Wilma told them what her father had said, her friends suddenly agreed that John was just about the most handsome man they had ever seen. So when John proposed on St. Valentine's Day, she turned him down, but hinted that he might persist. By March they were engaged, and when he kissed her, she felt a jolt under her skin. There was no other explanation, she thought, but love. But what had she known about love? About as much, she supposed, as the poor spinster poet Emily Dickinson, whose just-published volumes Wilma had devoured as a teenager. Her favorite lines, wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. But all Wilma had dreamed of then were ice-skating parties, bonfires, Hubert Graham sneaking his hand inside her muff to clutch her hand, pressing his shoulder against hers as the firelight flickered across his face and danced in his dark eyes. And then, years later, when John Mickelson had kissed her, one night even daringly pressing a hand to her breast, she had thought that was all there was, really. The wedding night had been alarming, to say the least. A horrendous puncturing of her innards. She'd had no idea what to expect, and he had simply brazened ahead. What could she have expected? She had no idea now. Perhaps something more discreet, more genteel? Certainly not the heaving, painful, liquid mess it was. Subsequent nights were less surprising, though the whole of the act was still more than she could comprehend. She bore through by focusing on one sensation at a time, his piquant smell pervading her breath, his clammy cheek pressing hers, his hand trailing over her skin, her gasp when he met the place where she parted. The newfound knowledge clotted in her gut. Some of her turned to mist and crept out the pores of her skin. She blamed her father. She had counted on him to insist that she stay in school at least one more year. For as long as she could remember, he had professed that her study of the piano was his dream as much as hers. He had also always been able to construe just what she wanted, whether she told him the truth or its opposite. So, following her engagement, she hadn't hesitated to tell him, in John's presence, that she wanted the wedding to be this summer. To her horror, he voiced not one objection, and even offered to host the reception at his home. Of course, he had recently acquired a new family, a widow and her 3 adolescent sons. Wilma and her sisters might as well have been dust. She set her wedding for July, and made certain it was extravagant enough that the bills, at least, would not escape her father's attention. But in the end, she knew the blame was hers to share. She was a frog, splayed out flat with a finger pressed in the middle of its back that kept it from jumping. Lighten the pressure just by a whisker, and the frog squirmed to get free. Lift the finger entirely, and there was no telling where the frog would leap off to. Marriage, for example. She did try to stay still whenever possible. True, she feared falling, tripping, other graceless mishaps. But mostly she feared that her legs would remember the joy of running and get away from her. As a child, she had been a top pick for neighborhood baseball games, and wrinkled her nose at her oldest sister's warnings that she was bound to be an old maid if she couldn't behave herself like a proper girl. But then, the strange summer that she was 12, her knees melted every time Hubert Graham winked at her, and in her heart blossomed a yearning that he would see her as more than a great lead-off hitter. With her sister's admonitions ringing in her ears, she finally set down a list of